First of all, welcome everybody to this session, which we're going to be looking at and rethinking, hopefully, our relationship with oil, and more specifically, peak oil. Now we have three speakers with us here this evening. We have to my immediate right is David Korowitz. David is a physicist by qualification and a human systems ecologist. He's on the executive of FASTA, and he's also on the board of CORE, and he's a director of the Risk Resilience Network. And David says he has a particular interest in systems dynamics, and I suppose where David particularly comes to mind for me anyway is he was the author of a document produced by FASTA earlier this year called Tipping Point, which is available on the FASTA website, which I believe is fasta.org. And if you haven't read Tipping Point, I couldn't recommend it strongly enough. It's about 50 pages or so. And in it, David sets out some near-term scenarios, which I think any of us with an interest in environment, climate, ecology, ourselves, our children, it really behoves us to read. So, further to the right, we have, I don't mean that politically, we have Richard O'Rourke. Richard is the director of the Association for the Study of Peak Oil in Ireland. Richard is a chemist by training, and he has a master's in renewable energy and in environmental policy. Richard has been with ASPO since 2005, and he agreed to be allowed to be described as a protege of the great Colin Campbell. So Richard is steeped in oil, you might say. I'll keep my introduction for Ciaran for when he arrives. I suppose since Davey wasn't here to introduce me, I'll have to do the honours myself. I suppose I've been involved for the last number of years as, I guess, an environmental writer and campaigner. Some of you will have come across me in the Irish Times over the last couple of years until they threw me out and for upsetting them. And so, anyway, my interest is, again, in environment and environmental systems. I'm particularly interested in where they coincide and collide with energy, because this became apparent to me very quickly. You can't write about environmental and ecological issues without writing about energy. The two basically they go in footstep with one another. So, and as you research, read, write and talk to people about energy, it becomes obvious that we're on the cusp of an extraordinary energy crisis. And it's an energy crisis that some people in what we will loosely call the environmental movement think is a good thing. They think it's a crisis that somehow or other is going to solve some of our other crises. I'd like to believe that that is not the case, unfortunately. I see Ciaran has arrived, so maybe you come and join us. And now I can say to the extreme right, to my extreme right, is Ciaran Cuffe. Ciaran needs few introductions, but we'll give him one anyway. Ciaran is, of course, a TD for Dún Laoghaire, which he's been since 2002, an architect and town planner by profession, and Ciaran has been, or is recently appointed as Minister for State with responsibility for sustainable transport, horticulture, planning and heritage, which I believe straddles 3 government departments, Ciaran. So we're delighted to have him here tonight, and Ciaran will obviously make a contribution in due course. So, as I was saying, my interest in this has been primarily environmental and sustainability, but I found it absolutely impossible to address these issues without also looking at energy. And energy takes us, no matter what way you look at it, to peak oil. I'll give you a couple of the facts. I'm sure you're familiar with them, but they're worth revisiting ever so briefly. Peak oil discoveries occurred 2 years after Ciaran's birth in 1965. That was the moment in history. Sorry about that.
You wouldn't do that to a woman.
This is true. This is the moment at which the most oil that we're ever going to discover was found, 1965, 45 years ago. So, the peak discovery is one issue. Peak production is another. Typically, peak production trails peak discovery by about 4 decades, maybe if you're lucky 5. So we reckon peak production, and I'm not the expert on it, luckily we have plenty of those here tonight, so I'm not going to get into speculation as to exactly when peak production occurs. I suppose we might also call that peak oil. And I brought along only one prop, slightly tatty from the dart, so please bear with me. This is the one that, you see, as I said, a lot of what I've been doing has been on climate change and environment. And as I'm sure any of those of you who've been following this will know, this has become a hornet's nest. Every other person, especially in the media, will tell you, climate change, that's not happening. Global warming, it's a hoax. We had a cold winter. CO2 is good for you. It makes the plants grow, etc., etc., etc. So it's become a battlefield a sort of an ideological battlefield, which is incredibly frustrating because the public sitting at home listening to the radio is going, what the hell is going on? There's some big row about climate change. Anyway, the point is that particular ship, unfortunately, I won't say it's sailed, but it's certainly taken on water. This, on the other hand, is a lot less contentious. And if I may, if you'll allow my slightly tatty graphic here, this is from the International Energy Agency. And what we have here is the world's liquid fuel supply. Over to our left here is 2008. The black line here, they estimated about 2012. And this blue line up at the top here is energy demand all the way out to 2030. All the other lines, I think everyone see that okay? All the other lines essentially are all the oil that we currently have access to. Every bit. Now, in case you're wondering whether, tar sands or shale oil are not in there, yes they are. The whole flaming lot. Non-petroleum, liquids, non-OPEC, petroleum, non-OPEC, conventional, unconventional, whatever you're having yourself. Okay? So with this gigantic hole here between how we're using energy and where we're going to get it from. And specifically here we're talking about liquid oil. So I was reading the Financial Times yesterday and just happened upon an interesting article about Fiat. They have a factory in Brazil. That factory produces more cars than Fiat produces in Italy. It produces a new car off the line every 20 seconds, 3,000 cars a day, and the Brazilian government subsidizes those cars because, obviously, they're playing catch-up with the rest of them, and you might say good luck to them. The point is that that's where this energy demand graph comes from. No matter what we do in the Western world, we're committed to a high energy future in the near term, and this is a ship that's extraordinarily difficult to turn around. I'm sure some of you read Morgan Kelly's cheerful prognosis for the Irish economy on Saturday. The line that caught my eye was towards the end. He quoted Ernest Hemingway, and he said, "Bankruptcy happens slowly, then all at once." So it's a line. Obviously, Morgan wasn't talking about energy. He wasn't talking about climate, but I think essentially it's something worth bearing in mind. This is what's remarkable about this chart is that this is uncontested. Even the loonies haven't got to this chart yet to tear it apart properly. They will. Trust me. They're going to come out with something crazy to fill the gap. But essentially, what we're looking at here is uncontested information. We're here. So I think we can move forward to the substantial part of this discussion right now. But I just wanted to set the context. As I said, I'm coming at it not as an energy specialist, not as a peak oil expert, but rather as somebody with an interest in climate, in environmental issues, and in ecology and how all these things collide. But as I say, to have one of these discussions in 2010 without addressing the energy crisis doesn't even cover it. This is the energy collapse, for my mind, seems invidious. And as I say, the belief among some people who would describe themselves as environmentalists that this is all good news and this is going to reduce our impacts and this is going to help us to our way out of the climate problem, I think is ill-founded, principally because the tools, the technological tools that we need to work our way out to a lower energy future face destruction in a peak oil scenario. That's the bit that gets overlooked in this. We cannot, technology, whether you like it or not, in various forms, for example, the whole green economy, etc., is predicated on the assumption that we're going to bring in a lot of smart technology that is going to help us to scale back and so on and to reduce our impacts. But we cannot do that in a peak oil post-peak oil situation that we haven't planned for. And the question really that I'd like to throw open now, and I'd like to start, if I may, with David Korowitz, is where are we, David, in all this? And maybe you take it from there. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you for all of you for coming. It is rather bizarre listening to the general society's discourse about our current predicament as is currently observed. In other words, we are in a financial crisis with fingers pointing as to who is to blame, who saw it, who should have done what. And yet we are quite clearly, without dispute, on the edge of a far greater crisis for which we are doing nothing collectively. It's not politicians' fault directly, it's a societal issue. 4 years ago, Forfos produced a report on Ireland, a baseline assessment of Ireland's oil dependency. And among the advice they drew on for that was by a Robert Hirsch. And he said, the world faced an unprecedented risk management opportunity, saying also that we would need, and I disagree with him, I think he's far too optimistic, but he said we would need at least 20 years lead time before a peak in oil production in order to manage the transition. Well, here we are at this very moment, probably at a peak of global oil production. And not only is that report still sitting away in Forfos doing what government reports tend to do, which is stand idle, this unprecedented risk management opportunity has been barely dealt with by governments and by societies across the world, except, funnily enough, from groups like Transition Towns, etc. Where we are now, it's hard to see because we're in a financial crisis, because of the financial crisis. In other words, demand for energy is being suppressed because we're doing less economic activity. So we're not quite sure where the ceiling is. But even in historical terms, oil prices are at quite a very high level. What we expect is that as the global economy starts to rise up again, whenever that happens, it'll suddenly be hit by higher energy prices. Now, it's sometimes said that higher peak oil means higher and higher energy prices. Of course, it can, but it doesn't mean that. Because societies can't pay any price for energy. As energy prices rise, it basically means that we've got to pay for the essentials, so discretionary consumption, the restaurants, all of the other stuff we use in our society starts to fall out of production, unemployment rises, etc., and we consume less oil, energy prices crash, and so you have this, pretty non-linear response of the economy. But the real issue is that our civilization, and by that I mean the expression of the global economy through the things we use, through our understanding, the way we communicate, is unstable to an energy withdrawal. What I mean by that is that as oil starts to deplete, the global economy does not contract at 3% per annum, for example. It starts to collapse, and with that, our civilization. And as John mentioned in terms of Morgan Kelly's observation about crises taking a long time to happen, but when they do, they happen fast, that is probably the scenario in which we're looking at now. And the reason it happens fast is because we don't quite see it, but we live in a very tightly integrated global economy. We are highly dependent upon very complex infrastructure that are dependent and leaning upon each other. IT and telecoms, the grid, the banking system. And each of these start to collapse and reinforce collapse in each other because of a small energy withdrawal. And what you could see it as, or as an example, imagine a three-legged stool, and it's sitting on the table here. If I cut off just a little bit of one leg, the stool, say an inch, the stool doesn't drop by an inch. The thing topples over. It's unstable. And that is exactly the same with our own globalized economy. What is more, peak oil effectively means peak gas, peak coal, and peak nuclear or any other sort of energy. What you find is a major collapse in all energy production because of our inability to pay for it, because of our inability to keep up the infrastructure, because of diseconomies of scale and so forth, etc. So that means that now, at this moment in history, we are at the most unique point. That if there are people 200 years from now, they will probably write stories or tell stories about a belle epoque, the belle epoque of human civilization. And they'll probably pick a point about the year 2000, say, and wonder at what we did. But after that, probably within the next decade, certainly within the next decade, they're going to say, then what happened? Because we are likely to see a major systemic collapse in our global economy, in our civilization, and all because one of our principal energy vectors starts to decline and a feedback loop kicks in and things start to collapse, which means for Ireland, severe issues of food security, mass unemployment, possible political collapse, and it's the same with every other country. In other words, even if Ireland had its own source of oil, because we're so globalised, if other countries start to fall down, our inputs for our production processes, the buyers for our exports, they all drop out, which collapses our economy. We can no longer keep up our health service. Our education system is dysfunctional. Our supply chains and our agriculture is off the wall. Our political systems are too slow and they cannot respond. And the problem of all of this is that we're not dealing with these issues, like that report from Forfos, commissioned by the Irish government, explicated. We're not doing it. And we can have all the words we want to mention technology, etc. That is all pie in the sky. Investment for the ESB grid of 22 billion, that'll never be raised, completed. It'll never be developed out. Why? Because our demand for electricity is going to start dropping as oil starts depleting. Why? Because the economic background that oil supports starts to fall away, and we don't need other energy sources. So here we are. This is our moment, and this is our choice. It's quite clear that people in government, even if they talk about peak oil, don't understand it. I don't mean that as a criticism. It actually becomes a complex issue as you follow what happens. But we need to get our heads around this as individuals, as a society, as politicians, as members of civil society. And the quicker we do that, the better, because we are in for one hell of a storm. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll probably get talking later.
Great. Thank you very much, David. That will give us plenty to talk about later. So I guess we might as well stay in the order in which we're seated and have arrived. So Richard O'Rourke, could I hand it over to you, please?
Sure. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Thanks for the invitation to come and speak, and thanks for coming along. It's obviously difficult to follow that. I'd like to tell you that David's all wrong, but I suppose from the perspective of the Association for the Study of Peak Oil and Gas and its founder, Dr. Colin Campbell, who has been campaigning to get this message onto the political agenda for almost 20 years now. It's been quite a journey to get to this point, and I suppose, obviously, unfortunately, we've arrived at the point which he warned us that we would have and had been calling for us to prepare for, as I said, almost 2 decades. As was shown in the introduction, the chart of forecasted oil production, it's become uncontroversial to say that conventional oil production is at its peak or well nigh on. It's approximately, at least in terms of consumption, 84 million barrels per day. We might get an extra 5 or 10%, squeeze an extra 5 or 10% out of that. But the consensus among the ASPO community, which is sort of a loose affiliation of energy experts from around the world, is that within the next 4 to 5 years, we can expect that production to go into terminal decline. And I suppose, as we saw with the run-up in prices up to the peak in 2008, that even in that high-price environment, the ability to bring on alternatives, such as the tar sands or biofuels, is limited. We can see that they start to run into technical and commercial difficulties. So we can reasonably expect that peak in conventional oil production also represents a peak in liquid fuels totally. We won't be able to ramp up the tar sands or the biofuels to replace the gap that emerges. And as we've seen, we probably wouldn't want to because of the climate change effects and pollution effects of the tar sands and the impact on food prices that we saw with the biofuels. I think also what within the ASPO community we've observed over the last 2 years in light of what happened after that run-up in oil prices. I mean, the summer of 2008, oil prices hit under $47 a barrel, and within 3 months of that, Lehman's collapsed, and as we all are very acutely aware, the domino effect in terms of knocking over our financial institutions, and I suppose the realization of the extent to which we kind of overextended ourselves financially became terribly apparent. And we would argue, or it is argued that there's a causal link there between the run-up in the oil price and the falling over of the banking system. Obviously, there was things going on within the financial system that were going to run into a problem eventually anyway, but the point is that the high oil price probably triggered it to fall over. So that we're now understanding better the link between the production of energy and our financial system, in the sense that banks give out loans on the premise that the economy will grow, and that growth is required to repay those loans plus the interest. And if the critical thing in there, and as we saw with the collapse of the banking crisis, is confidence. If the banks lose confidence in one another, the whole system becomes unstuck. And the thing that scares, I suppose, it's of the many things that could scare us, the one that is sort of at the top of the list at the moment is that when the realization that we're at maximum oil production starts to filter through into the general consciousness, there will be a realization that the economy can't continue to grow in order to repay these loans, in which case our confidence in the financial systems starts to be undermined. And as I said, it's a kind of a peculiar thing. And I suppose in some respects you kind of saw it just this week in the stock exchanges. The nature of the herd mentality, the sentiment that when the attitude changes, when it becomes pessimistic and people start to sell, everybody starts to sell. So you can kind of see these sort of massive drops in the stock market very quickly. So that when, as I said, that sort of collective consciousness filters through, and the realization, not only is the emperor naked, but we're all naked, that there will be, I suppose, as David talks about in his report, that that realization, and it's nothing other than the realization, which leads to a lack of confidence, which leads to the financial system becoming unstuck. And therein lies probably our greatest risk, and certainly in the context of Ireland, and we're not peculiar in any major respect in terms of how we're configured versus any modern economy. Although, I mean, we're obviously in a peculiar situation that we're having to borrow a lot of money currently just to keep the show on the road. And our ability to borrow that money is fundamentally premised on the confidence of the international financial markets that we will eventually be able to pay that back. So if, for example, the minister here was to say that not only do I believe in peak oil, which I suspect he'll probably tell us in a couple of moments, but for the international bond markets to kind of do the natural cause and effect sequence of events on that, we'll say, well, if Ireland's accepting peak oil, well, that means that Ireland won't be able to pay back all this money that it's borrowing. So we have a very difficult challenge there as regards expecting our government, particularly the government we have right now, and I don't mean that in any sort of party political sense, I just mean in terms of the actual people that have the responsibility to keep the show on the road today. They're faced with a dilemma that in order to keep the show on the road, they've got to keep the confidence of the international bond markets. And that obviously runs contrary to any ability to take steps to deal with the problem of peak oil. And certainly within, and that, notwithstanding even that, is the fact that we've got only years. We don't have the 10, 20 years that we could take to get a relatively smooth transition into alternatives such as electric vehicles or whatever else. Understanding that dilemma means that we'll have to think about, if we're to try and proactively try and deal with this, it doesn't appear apparent based on, again, the consensus within the community that there's any easy way to deal with this. And not only that, even the hard options aren't particularly attractive either. And I think that's, I'm certainly not going to be able to answer any or offer any solutions as I sit on this panel here tonight, other than, what I will be doing is pointing out all the difficulties that we have to approach or deal with. And in that regard, it's a tough story. In some respects, you might be better off if you just didn't know.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard. So now that we know that ignorance is bliss, that's in no way, Ciaran, handing over to you on that note.
Great introduction.
Sure. But maybe we could hand it over to the Minister at this point. Ciaran.
Thank you, John. I guess politics is in the business of hope, and I think we can work our way through this. I think it's tough. I think it's challenging. I've seen in the 28 years that I've been in the Greens, I've seen a great many times when there was a lot of despair out there. There was a lot of pessimism about the future, much of it justified. I guess my sort of introduction to the environmental movement was going back 30 years ago. I read a book published by Scientific American, Ecoscience, Ehrlich. I can't remember the other authors. And there was huge concern over overpopulation back then. And that was the kind of the issue du jour. That was the big problem, the big challenge. That continues to be a huge challenge, and we tend to ignore it quite a bit. We tend to ignore the fact that because of, or certainly related to overpopulation, we have enormous poverty in a huge amount of the world, and a huge amount of people are dying in developing countries as a result of the population challenge. And that's still there and doesn't go away. But I digress slightly. I want to tell you a little bit about my background, tell you what we're doing, we in government, the Greens in government are doing, and then talk a little bit about what needs to be done. My own new job as of last month is I'm a junior minister with responsibilities in agriculture, transport and environment. And I think on the face of it, it's an excellent choice of portfolios to join the dots on sustainability and to address many of the concerns that are out there on peak oil. I tend not to isolate peak oil by itself, but to bring it together into the three key issues of climate change, peak oil and energy security, and I think they all need to be looked at simultaneously. And there are huge challenges. I think agriculture is one of the biggest one, where essentially the Department of Agriculture is hugely geared towards towards beef, towards meat, towards animals. And if we really want to talk about sustainable food supplies, we're talking a very different language to the language of beef exports, where we're providing 8 times more beef than we need in Ireland, and we're exporting it around Europe. Purely from a commercial point of view, it's a great success story. We're providing loads of high-quality beef to Europe, but as I think almost all of you in the room know, that's not a great way to use our energy, and we need to think about how we can make much better use of our land. I think looking at the issue of peak oil, we have to address what a low-carbon lifestyle would look like. And I think that's a challenge to everybody in the room to contemplate what needs to be done or what can be done. I guess to take my own sort of thoughts on how you can do it, I think it can be a good news story. I think travelling less, spending more time closer to home, insulating your home, using less and making more of what you have is potentially a very good story, and I think people could easily argue that we are doing that as a result of the economic challenges that we're in at the moment. I'm a bit of a nerd, and over the last year I've every week measured how much energy, how much electricity and how much gas we've used at home, and there's 5 of us in the house, and we've more or less used a ton of carbon each in the course of a year, just in kind of home energy use, which is not great, but not awful either. It's a very old building that we've done our best to kind of insulate and do all those things with. Used about a ton on that. In terms of my own travel, I've driven about 5,000 kilometres. That's another half a ton on top of that. Food is a biggie, and we still haven't got a very good system of analysing how much energy is used in the food we eat, but we're getting towards that. Some of the multiples are starting to do carbon label on food, or essentially give you a flavour of the energy that's used. And I suspect that my own lifestyle over the last year has been kind of much lower on carbon than an awful lot of people. And I'd contrast that with people who would drive a huge amount every year, who would take a lot of flights every year. I managed not to fly at all over the last 18 months. That's probably going to change quite a bit, ironically, due to going to meetings about climate change. And, the need to be at climate change meetings here and then get to the next climate change meeting in Brussels 18 hours later. So that's a challenge. I guess what I'm getting at is that the low carbon lifestyle, using less energy, using less oil, is possible, and I think there's a fair amount of good news in it if we manage it correctly. What are we doing in government to address peak oil? Well, I guess we've couched an awful lot of what we're doing under the banner of climate change, and in doing that, my colleague Eamon Ryan is trying to decarbonise energy production and use in Ireland. To do that, you need to make some tough decisions. You need to reinforce the grid so we can bring wind energy, electricity from where the wind is, which is mainly on the west of Ireland, to where the people are, which is mainly on the east of Ireland. And that, without a magic wand, that involves putting lots of dirty big pylons in the middle of Meath. And that's a controversial issue. It's a challenging issue. It requires a lot of planning mechanisms to make it happen. And we're working through a lot of those challenges at the moment. A lot of regulation, a lot of discussion of how you link in your energy, how you link the export of Irish energy to the UK through interconnectors and the regulation that goes with that. And that's taking up an awful lot of time. In the meantime, we're providing a significant grant aid system for householders to reduce the amount of energy. You've heard of the home energy schemes, the Greener Home scheme. All of those schemes are out there, and they're doing a lot to simply offer you money to work out how much energy you're using and how you can reduce that fairly dramatically and provide grant aid to do that. That is all good, and it's all happening. In environment, we're reforming the planning process. We're trying to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. In a sense, we've come in to admire the stable door long after it's been left open and the horses bolted, particularly given that we were building almost 70, 80, 90,000 new homes a year at the peak of the boom. Nonetheless, I think we've put in place a much better system the next time we build. Reduction in energy use in new homes, and we've done 40%, we bring that up to 60%. We're also, so that's in the building regs, but also in the planning bill, we're really trying to make sure we don't get the kind of suburban and rural sprawl that we got over the last 20 years. A huge increase in the amount of urban generated rural driving and living. That's not good for our lifestyle, it's not good for the planet, it's not good for reducing energy use. That stuff is happening. In transport, we have the Smarter Travel Policy document, which is a significant change of direction. It means that we want to see, instead of 60% of peak hour journeys being done by car, we want to get that down to 40% and increase the amount that will be done by public transport. We're straightening out the bus routes in Dublin. We're investing in the Dart Underground, the Dublin Metro, in providing more public transport choices, and also the slow mode stuff as well, the walking and cycling. There's a lot of been done to that with direct finance to local authorities. In agriculture, we're promoting organic. I'm promoting the use of allotments. I'm promoting the issues around local food, around farmers' markets, trying to get farmers' markets away from the perception of elitism into supplying a lot of your everyday food needs. And I think that builds a lot of resilience into the system and will make us certainly much better able to cope with shocks, energy price shocks, or the possibility of energy security shocks where Putin might just decide to turn the tap off. So there's a lot more resilience being built in there. How much does this do to tackle the kind of challenges that John, David and Richard have spoken about earlier? I think not that much. I think they're good programs that fit in nicely with the current narrative and public discussion around these issues. how do you kind of deal with how do you move the debate into dramatic changes that make us capable of dealing with oil at €200 a barrel, or not there at all if the supply chain collapses? I'm not sure. I think in politics you try and deal with what's possible, and that's what we're doing. And in doing so, if we kind of move the debate on, I think that's healthy. The debate has to be brought a lot further, and it's not just about the party that we're in government with. It's about convincing the other party that's out there, Fine Gael, because these two parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, tend to be business as usual parties, and we tend to kind of try and poke our partners in government with gently and sometimes strongly on the issue of a new programme for government. But Fine Gael needs every bit as much of a change of direction, and Labour does to a lesser extent. But in the whole debate around introducing a carbon levy, which now applies to pretty much every bit of carbonised product energy that you use in Ireland, and I think that's a great success story, even if it's at whatever it is, €15 a tonne. In the middle of that whole debate, there was a lot of people saying you need to have an out clause for farmers, you need to have an out clause for people on low incomes, you need to have an out clause for people who live in rural areas, you need to have an out clause for the travel tax. So there's a huge amount of political capital being spent of you need waivers for everything in the climate levy. And the lesson from the US is once you start doing pork barrel politics, once you start trying to please everybody by giving them a bit of pork from the barrel, you end up with a debased political debate. And I'm glad to say, certainly in terms of the carbon levy, I think it's gone across the board. That's not to say that we don't have to provide support for people, let's say, with the fuel allowance in the winter. We need those kind of supports in there, but we put in the climate levy and the carbon levy, and that's a step in the right direction. So finally, to say, well, what needs to be done? Climate change bill, that's under preparation. We had a lengthy meeting about it yesterday. Huge amount of background work has been done to bring in a bill that mandates the 3% targets. I tend not to obsess about the targets, but concentrate more on what we do within the individual departments. That's crucial, because you can talk about targets till you're blue in the face, but how do you actually change the regulations, the legislation, the supports, and the behaviour? That's the more important issue, and that has ramifications for food, for travel, for construction, for retrofitting, for all of that. Finally, I went to Copenhagen just before Christmas last year, and obviously the 3 C's of the failure of Copenhagen, the climate gate issue, the cold winter, they have all caused difficulties for the climate change debate, which in turn influences the peak oil debate. We have to do a lot more in terms of increasing awareness. We tried to do it with climate change. Things have slipped back quite a bit. We have every bit as big a job to do with the challenge of peak oil, and I think this evening is part of the starting point of some of that debate, but there is a huge amount of movement required before we get the public consciousness to accept what needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ciaran, for batting on a sticky wicket. If I could just kick off by asking if I could leave it with the Minister. One of the statements in the FASTA report, Tipping Point, stated there's a high probability that our integrated and globalised civilization is on the cusp of a rapid and near-term collapse. An extraordinary statement, and I'd like to think it was an outrider statement that didn't in any way reflect, our possible near-term futures. If I could put you on the spot and ask, around the cabinet table, I know you don't have special access to cabinet, but I'm sure you have access to people who do. Around the cabinet table, has the phrase peak oil, has it entered the political dialogue, even within Dáil Éireann?
I don't think it has, to be frank. I think there is a process of education that is crucial, And the way things work in politics, after spending a huge amount of my life in that sphere, is that you have to educate the decision makers, you have to lobby them, you have to sit down with them and talk them through the process. That's crucial. We can have debates and agreement and discussion till the cows come home. But to actually affect change in policy, you need to get to the decision makers, and that's what many of the NGOs that are out there are very good at doing. I don't think the Association for Peak Oil has been good at that. I don't think FASTA has been particularly good at political lobbying. The problem is that you can paint the picture of where the challenges are that are 5 years, 3 years, 10 years, 20 years away, and that doesn't impact too much on the way we do politics in Ireland. What does impact is something happening today or tomorrow or next week. And that's common to politics the world over, but I think it's more so in Ireland because we have two very large centrist parties who are more populist than, in the best sense of the word, popular and not policy driven. That's the challenge.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Minister. Richard, maybe you'd like to respond in terms of, say, where organisations like ASPO, maybe where you see the challenges, or indeed, as Ciaran suggests, where maybe you're falling down in terms of actually influencing this policy discussion. Not to put you on the spot or anything.
It's the first time or it's been said that ASPO isn't good at lobbying, but I suppose that would have to be true. I mean, we're largely a group of scientists and engineering people. We're not politicians, we're not lobbyists, and ASPO doesn't have a budget. I mean, as Ciaran knows, I've lobbied him, I've been into him. I've been into Deputy Coveney, who's the Fine Gael spokesperson on energy. I've been with Liz McManus. All recently, in the last 12 months. In the case of Simon Coveney, only in the last few weeks. And what's interesting, obviously, is the fact that they're well aware. I've spoken with the Chief Scientific Advisor to the government. He's actually briefed Cabinet on peak oil, which is his remit. He's only done it once. He went down and he visited with Dr. Colin Campbell just to make sure that it was a credible story, and sufficiently convinced he gave his briefing. So no doubt that, even the private members bill that Deputy Coveney brought in front of the Dáil last month and the debate that happened, which was quite well informed. I mean, if anything, it demonstrates a level of sophistication and understanding in our government about this issue. But it equally demonstrates, and I think I certainly heard it in Minister Cuffe's discussion about what the government is trying to do, that the rate at which, I suppose, in terms of how politics operates and the speed at which it operates, means that it's not well equipped to deal with a problem like this. And I think that within the ASPO community, and we've seen it in the UK, where they put an industry task force together, where with the sort of small lobbying resources that we do have, we're investing them in industry, where we see that they have resources and capability to do things and respond in a way that government really isn't equipped to do. Governments tend to follow rather than to lead, and deal with the day-to-day crisis rather than have the opportunity to think 15, 20 years ahead. And again, thinking 15, 20 years ahead is no longer part of the solution, you know. And really, it's, I think, if I were in a position to lobby government to try and do something about this problem, it would be on the disaster risk management side. And that can be done in a low-key way with relatively little resources, so that at least there are a group of people at various points in society that if this disaster should occur, like anything, like the swine flu pandemic that we thought might hit the country last winter. A lot of work was done by the state in preparation for such a disaster. There's no reason why the government couldn't do exactly the same thing for some of the scenarios that David describes in his report. And I think it's in that single regard, because the stuff that the government are doing is long-term and it's necessary, but it doesn't address the risk management problem that we have in the near term.
Sure. Psychologists tell us that we all have something called a worry quota. That means we can only be, each of us has our own personal worry quota. So, if you're a worrier, you will worry a certain amount, but you can't really worry all that much more than that. And I just wonder, and maybe I could throw this back to the panel, is there a feeling, for example, maybe both politically and also within the general public, that we've sort of used up our worry quota? People are concerned at the moment about maybe people who were concerned about climate change 3 or 4 years ago, especially around the time of the IPCC. They've moved on to being worried about their jobs, worried about these very direct concerns. And that worry displaces other worries. It doesn't generally run alongside. You literally you got this worry, you push it out and you put that one over here and you pack it up. And I just wonder, in this scenario, where are we going to fit in our heavily stressed worry quotas? Peak oil. Maybe I could put that one to David.
I really don't think it does anybody any good to just sit around worrying. It's destructive in all sorts of ways. I absolutely concur with Richard's point that, what we need is risk management. We're not going to change the system. We're locked into it. Our welfare is. It will crash apart when it crashes apart. What we need is something underneath it within society to cushion the blow. Good preparations, good preparatory risk management would go some way towards that. It doesn't actually mean going out with a megaphone and saying, batten down the hatches. But there's another point that I think we need to start, in a sense, like preparing the popular narrative or talk for these sort of really severe crises, is a lot of people in Ireland are feeling hard done by. Promises they thought they made were not kept. The money they thought they were entitled to has been lost. The health service they expected as a first world country they were entitled to isn't quite up to scratch. And yet, coupled with that is an enormous sense of entitlement. That, and I mean this as no criticism, meaning asking us really to step back and look at our condition as a species on this planet at this time. When those civil servants marched through Dublin, this now is not a criticism, it's just asking us to look back, and marched about the cuts in their pensions, etc., some months back, the thought struck me that they are in the top 2 or 3% of the world's richest people, critiquing the 0.2 or 3% of the world's richest people. And that if you're going into a world where we'll be losing an awful lot, that those further expectations, our economy will not recover, ever, and this is a global issue, that one of the sides, and I'm not religious, but one of those old things was counting your blessings. And that we've been remarkably reluctant to say, look what we have. Look what we have acquired. And that this acquisition was not based, though we might like to think so, just on our native brilliance, our wily ways and our cleverness with computers. It was based on the fact that we are a central part of a globalizing civilization and we had a good head run with it. That's it. Now, again, it's not a criticism. It's the way things happen. And I think that as a starting point, and saying, you know what? We don't have a third world health service. We've got a damn good health service that 99.9% of the world would be delighted to have. It is our expectations about what we want that are a problem. And as things get worse, which they will, and then probably get frighteningly worse, it would be good if we had started to develop at least a narrative of our own predicament. And what I mean by a narrative of our own predicament is a way of talking about how we got here, why we're here at this point, and being able to say, it's not government's fault. Collectively, as a species, we've walked into a trap. It is beyond our ability to manage. We can manage it locally to a certain degree, but not globally. We are trapped in it. It is not somebody's fault. It is not the foreigner's fault. It's not whoever. Actually, it's our species' inheritance. It's our evolutionary, biologically, cultural inheritance, and the happenstance that we found and discovered a source of energy that was concentrated, and we were able to develop it and piggyback our civilization off it. So that, as the communicative side of the public, doesn't have to be a lot of it about peak oil. But coupled with that, we need to do emergency and resilience planning, and that's part of risk management. Effectively, our whole society, government, civil service, has put their money on one horse. That's where your pensions are. That's where your expectations of future government finances are. That's where your education system is, and your employment, and your food security. And that is that the economy will keep growing. Well, that won't happen. Now, you don't have to make a song or a tale or a dance about it. All you need to do is say, there is a risk that this won't happen. It's not yay or nay. That's not how you make these sort of decisions. The stakes are too high, the risks are too real. What you do is say, if this fails, what do we do? Do we have something there? And in the interim, life can go on, we can have our things. What we just try and do is emphasise the base. That's why, though I think it's sometimes transition towns, for instance, can be remarkably chirpy and optimistic, more than I'd see it. I think, they have a huge role to play in actually starting to create that narrative, that communication ways of speaking, because it's going to hit us, and there's not much we can do about it except prepare defensive. But there we go. That's one side, I would say, is how you articulate it to people in the public.
Thank you very much, David. There's a journalist and policy expert called Gwyn Dyer, and Dyer by name and Dyer by nature. Gwyn has written a book called Climate Wars. Now, don't be misled by the title. It's a strictly non-fiction publication. And what he's done really is extrapolated the effects of climate pressures and so on into the 21st century. In other words, what might happen in terms of resource wars and so on. And essentially, how do civilizations resolve their issues and conflicts? And then when you apply some pressure, population pressure, which Ciaran referred to earlier, which I think doesn't get nearly half enough discussion, we're adding a Germany, population-wise, every 12 months, and we'll continue to do so until something happens to prevent that, but that's unstoppable. And anyway, Gwyn Dyer's analysis runs roughly like this. At the moment, we exist in the perfect lacuna of opportunity. There's never been a greater time for humanity. I think David referred to it as a belle epoque. We live somewhere towards the edge of a belle epoque, and in that period, we have the unique opportunity to globally organise our politics. Because no matter what Ciaran and his colleagues do, truthfully, we're just one cabin in a big ship. And the condition of that cabin doesn't matter. What matters is the condition of the hull. And therefore, I think we all accept that. We have a global issue here. So the easy thing to do is everybody throw their hands up and say there's nothing we can do. Obviously, we don't have that choice because this is where we are and this is where we're stuck. So the difficulty here, I suppose, or the challenge, if you like, is the scenario set out by Gwyn Dyer, which they touch on peak oil, but they don't really dwell on it unduly. None of those scenarios are compatible with there being very many people around. We're talking about probably 500 million people by mid-century. This is from current level of just under 7 billion to, projected by 2020, 2030 to peak at 8.5 to 9 billion, then heading back to 500 million. And it's an extraordinary set of scenarios. And the reason I mention Gwyn Dyer is he's not a climate activist. He's not an environmentalist. He's a policy analyst who's been writing for the last 25 years about how countries negotiate with one another. That's why I found his analysis really, really surprising. I was kind of, you normally get these type of scenarios from what they call the deep green side of things. So I suppose maybe I could unfairly lob that grenade back towards Ciaran. Are we, and you mentioned in your own discussion about how you feel there's not that much we can do to alter the trajectory, but while at the same time remaining hopeful and positive. How do we square that circle, Ciaran?
I don't want to be overly pessimistic about changing the debate or the narrative. Or I do believe in that tipping point thing, that you get to a stage where suddenly everybody understands and changes what they do. I think that is important. David, I think you're 100% right that this sense of entitlement, and it's quite crazy the level of expectation that people have out there as to what can be done. I was struck by Richard, your point about the good debate. Well, we always have shreds of pretty damn good debates in the Oireachtas. The problem is, I think Google has a lot to answer for in terms of the quantity of the quality of debate that we have every week at this kind of private members' time. And I think it was Deputy Terence Flanagan who was exposed on that when he gave a reasonably good speech about the banks, and Joan Burton realised that she had given the same speech several months previously. So there's a lot of Googling going on, and people suddenly become very knowledgeable very quickly on the issue of the week. And I appreciate, Richard, that you've spoken to Simon Coveney and Liz McManus, etc., etc. But it's the Bernard Allens or the Bernard Durkins. You've got to get to the people who actually don't know this topic at all. And I'm not saying that, Richard, you have to do it and you have to transform ASPO into being a political lobby group overnight. You don't have the resources or the capabilities to do that. I think the debate can move, and I think the debate can move very quickly. And I tend to be hopelessly optimistic about what technology can do. There was a great debate at Copenhagen about the usual China versus America debate and who will tackle or crack climate change first. And in essence, people felt that China won because they were doing all the product development and production very quickly, whether it be LED lighting, whether it be new energy storage systems. They're making it happen very, very quickly. And while there is some amazing innovation in the US, I always tend to think the US came up with the design for a school bus in about 1952 and haven't changed it in the intervening 60 years. Why? Because it was a pretty good design in the first place, and because they've had chunks of oil for the last 50 or 60 years. So sometimes the US can get pretty stuck in its ways. But I think China is moving at this white-hot pace of innovation in improving technology. And I guess my own background as an architect and as a planner, I know you can build a passive house today. I know you can plan a community that's much less reliant on lots of travel and lots of energy today. So I tend to be... I mean, if you turned off the lights now, you'd still have natural light outside that would allow you to host an evening meeting for the next 5 months. If we probably put on our jackets, we'd be warm enough in here for the next 5 months, and in winter we'd probably have to wear a couple of extra jumpers. And we've been there before in terms of the sudden shocks in the emergency, where we actually managed to provide ourselves with enough, more or less, food and energy to keep going through a very difficult 5 or 6 year period. Pretty bleak when you have to go through it, but the technology has improved somewhat since then. I'm simply saying that I do believe technology will help us through a lot of this, and we have had a similar crisis before. And if we do get the hint of this shock, I think we can change fairly quickly in a lot of what we do.
Okay, Ciaran, just on... I know Richard is itching to get back in there, but just on technology, I think a point that, again, has come through very strongly from the FAST report is that, it takes... No one company, for example, can produce a microchip. It could be 50, 60 different organisations combining their skills across 5 continents to produce 1 microchip. And I suppose this is the concern that those of us who look at this issue have, is that maybe back in the 40s, and I remember my late father telling me about a trick he was in the army, in the Irish army, and he said one of their tricks was, they got really knacky at, was cutting a match with a knife, with a Bowie knife, in 4. Why? So you could light 4 times with it. That's how scarce things were. Things like boiling tea 3 and 4 times. So, however, we're in a whole different situation now. We're dependent on technology in a way that my parents' generation never were. And this concerns me enormously, and I suspect it does generally here. So, Richard, maybe you'd like to jump back in.
Well, I think in many respects the paradigm that we're in terms of the opportunity for technology to get us out of this fix, or the idea that, well, we dealt with this in the 70s, or we dealt with this back in World War II, or however, in the past, are sort of misleading supports. They're rubrics. Insofar as, in World War II, when Britain almost managed to feed itself, its population was half of what it is today. If we had a kind of scenario, sort of worst-case scenario that David describes in his report, and the supply lines for food, we've got enough food in our supermarket system to last maybe a week. And if you want to see an example of how things can get bad very quickly, you just go back to the Petrol Protest in the UK in 2000. The head of Sainsbury had to write to the Prime Minister and said, you better solve this problem bloody quick, or we're not going to have food on the shelves. You can't turn around to 4.5 million people when there's no food on the shelves of the supermarkets and say, you need to go into your back garden and plant potatoes and carrots, and you'll be fine in 6 months once they've grown. That's the nature of the problem. So from a risk management perspective, it's very dangerous to think that A, technology will solve the problem, and B, we've dealt with this before and we'll just go back and do what we did the last time. We live in a very different world.
Sure. Okay. Now, we've had a good run. I think the panel have had a very good run. So I'd like at this point to ask the audience who've borne with us maybe to get involved. And we have a roaming mic. Davey has a mic there. And so maybe at this point, I'm sure there must be some questions arising. Davey, just here to it's behind the pillar of society. There you go.
Can I have 2 questions, maybe? One is that the mainstream narratives and the public consciousness of the issues that will be faced shortly. I'm curious as to what the panel thinks drives this mainstream narrative. I'm thinking, like, for example, of Tony O'Reilly and so forth. Who is directing the narrative, and what is their agenda, and do they know what's going on? I got my tinfoil hat on here, I suppose, but I'm curious as to what the panel thinks of this, what's driving the narrative right now. Maybe,
David, you might like to take that one.
Again, I'm sceptical of the idea of some Sangali in the background, some Randolph Hearst or whatever, pulling strings and creating a narrative for us.
But should we lobby Tony O'Reilly?
I think he's probably as ignorant. Well, looking at his investments, he's as ignorant as what's happening as the rest of us. I think as a culture, as a species, we do particular things, and I think part of that is our evolutionary inheritance. We're short term, or the economists would say we're big discounters. We notice change, stimulation. It gives us an endorphin rush. We evolved in a world of scarcity, where you did eat when you got up, when eating was going, because you mightn't catch something for a while. Our ideas of status, he's better than me, I'm better than him, and that sort of thing. That's in our nearest relations, from bonobos and chimps to horses to all sorts of things. When we look at it amongst ourselves, it's not some evil conspiracy. You look and say, hold on, this is part of our evolutionary heritage. And, we can critique and go, oh, how terrible it is to be status conscious. But you kind of go, no, that's part of us, and also our anger at it is part of it as well. So all of these things provide a template for who we are. And, in a way, when we stand back, we shouldn't go beating ourselves up over it. any more than I should beat myself up that I'm short-sighted. I mean, you know, we have two legs. At the same time, our moral discourse is an interspecies way of regulating each other's behaviour, in a nutshell. And I think one of the important things is not that we can find somebody who controls the narrative when we go to Tony O'Reilly or whoever. But I do think that other types of issues come in. I mean, if you want to do social change and there's vast inequality, you're looking for trouble. You're looking for trouble for all of us. Yeah? But actually, I think, you know, a lot of those people who think they're rich, by which I'm including all of us, because we are very rich, we are the elite of the world, that we're all going to lose much of what we think our wealth is. So that will do a lot of equalising for us, whether we want it or not. So maybe other people have other views on those sort of narratives.
Sure. No, I think you've covered it pretty comprehensively. So maybe I might move that microphone around. There's one on the front, and maybe this gentleman on the front, please.
Thanks, Richard. Just wanted to go back to your point on the financial aspect of it. You know, is it your belief? I know that there's no guarantees for the future, but is it your belief that, given that we live in a highly leveraged society, our world reserve currency is, you know, the Americans have never had as much debt. When that realization hits, that we won't have more money, our monetary system won't work with less energy available. Do you see the financial collapse really being the first point, as opposed to we don't have the fuel? You know, will that be the real crunch point in your estimation?
Well, I'll quickly qualify it and say it's not necessarily my estimation, because I mean I'm far from a monetary expert, but and in that regard I can kind of blame my colleagues and hide behind their expertise. But as I said, over the last 2 years, and particularly in the last 12 months, the realization has been that the historian 200 years from now will look back and say, it was the peaking in the oil. But for us right now, where we'll see it manifesting is in our financial system. Yeah, that is what we believe. And it's that, as I said, the issue of confidence and the leverage and the debt.
So would you see a resultant currency crisis then falling out of that?
Well, again, there's lots of people who are predicting monetary problems who know nothing about peak oil, just in terms of because we operate a fiat debt-based current monetary system. So, as you say, I mean, the future is not predetermined. But yeah, again, from a risk management perspective, that's certainly one that needs to be managed carefully. Yeah.
So, just a final sort of query on that, Ciaran, to yourself. Maybe, with peak oil being discussed to a limited degree, you mentioned overpopulation. Our monetary system, given that it must grow, it's based on growth. You know, does that ever come into the equation on the debate that we cannot change our society and maintain our current monetary system?
We do have debates all the time, certainly within the Green Party, about growth, no growth, low growth. I think a low level of growth is necessary given the changes in technology that happen all the time. You can produce more with less, and unless you have a future that envisages wide-scale unemployment, there will always be a small amount of growth. But I would very quickly divide growth into good growth and bad growth, energy intensive, socially undesirable growth, and good stuff happening. Kind of the production of LED lights as opposed to CFLs, as opposed to tungsten, could be seen as being positive growth. And I think we look at growth and say, oh, the maths doesn't work. You can't have growth indefinitely. It'll just gobble up all of the planet by simple maths over a fairly short period. I tend to think you can have 3% growth in the right kind of direction for certainly a very long period of time.
3% translates into twice as much GDP in 20 years.
Yeah, but what is that GDP? Is it in low energy solutions, or is it in buying 10D large Mercedes? And those are the kind of choices. And I guess the lesson from this crisis in Ireland is that we in the Green Party very clearly see an awful lot of the new growth, the new jobs coming out of the green stuff in agriculture, in energy, in transport, in construction. You see it every day of the week in the trucks out there with BER registered on the back of them, who are putting in insulation, who are making that stuff happen. I mean, yes, the debate has to shift in terms of what we see as being desirable or status. To kind of say to somebody with a drink in your hand, oh, I've got lots of insulation in my attic, it's not quite the same as saying my enormous Mercedes is outside. But I think that's changing. There's a funny status to the Toyota Prius in a weird way. I'm not saying we need lots more lower energy cars. I think we need to have less cars. But I think the debate is changing. I think there is very good growth in certain areas. There's god-awful growth. And if we make the shift, in my mind, into lower growth in the right areas, I think that means using less energy to produce a lot more social capital and good development.
I suppose it does leave us, Ciaran, with the problem that those Brazilians I mentioned earlier who are looking forward to receiving their new car.
That's true. John, can I just say, unfortunately, I have a vote in the Dáil, so I have to leave absolutely 5 minutes ago, actually.
That's okay. We won't start lashing into you for another 5 minutes, Ciaran, all right?
Appreciate that.
And we'd like to...
You are recording it, so I can listen back to work out who said what.
Well, can I thank the Minister very much indeed for joining us. Thank you. Thanks, Ciaran. Cheers. Now we can get on to the serious bit of bashing politicians. Excellent. Okay. As I say, I referred to it in my preamble that while we may talk about better models of growth, and I'm not sure about that 3% model. I saw a couple of raised eyebrows here behind me on a 3%. I think 3% to anywhere is the highway to hell. Maybe we should. There was another. Maybe just let in somebody new, please. Yeah. There you go.
Question to David about peak oil. Two things. You mentioned about peak everything. It's all the same. Gas, oil and coal. But surely coal, there's vast amounts of coal. Maybe there's a bit more of gas. Certainly peak oil. And that when the oil goes, the Chinese certainly can use their vast amounts of coal, which is very pollutant. So that's very scary. Second question then is about just another perverse situation. Climate change, North Pole. Is that going to release huge amounts of oil, which is absolutely appalling scenario? So that could push peak oil. What do we mean by peak oil when this oil is now obtainable? So I've always thought about that. I'm interested in an answer on it.
I think this is where, I suppose, peak oil is a new subject as an idea and its implications. And Colin Campbell, who Richard knows well, was one of the early people, and we're not really talking that long ago. So our knowledge and understanding and thinking about it has really been rather recent. And one of those sort of recent awarenesses, I suppose, is how interlinked the global economy is, how tightly coupled. We don't see it because we use things. We see things around us. We don't see the whole network of systems that brought those things to us. And I'm not just talking about the pen and the plastic and the petroleum and all of that. I'm talking about, but of course that relied on a myriad different monetary systems around the world. It relied on telephones and IT networks and all sorts of other things. And the fact that I can afford to buy this, or well, somebody gave it to me, but that if I bought this, the fact that I could afford to buy this is because I'm exchanging my labours across the world. And we're all like that. And the thing about it, with this tight coupling, is that if oil starts to go down and we can't grow the economy, the first thing we're hit with is a financial monetary crisis. Then we start to be hit by, which will be very severe. Then an interlinked food crisis, an infrastructure crisis, etc., etc. A huge list of things. And suddenly you find, not just that your oil started to go down, and actually starts to drop very fast, not like that normal curve, the actual oil that's available, it means, well, factories close, so they won't be turning on their light or running their machine that runs on gas or electricity. And suddenly then you find that actually energy prices start to drop, but we become even poorer, and we can afford even less. And that, for instance, I'll give you an example, say, of gas and Russian gas. It's funny, it was always mentioned about Putin turning off the gas. That's unlikely. The guy wants money. He's not Mr. Evil or any more necessarily Mr. Evil than the rest of us. The real issue is they've invested on the expectation of future growth, that they would build, very expensive Russian gas, because it is, like all things, it's getting harder and harder to get gas and coal, even though there's plenty there. They invest in very expensive gas extraction. They build pipelines right across the continent. That's very expensive. If our gas use in Europe drops by 30%, they might find that all their margin is gone, and anything less than that becomes unviable. So they stop investing in further gas production or coal, it doesn't matter what else. And when you lose your think of it like this. Imagine you're in a landscape and you're standing and there's hills here and all of that. And you know the way when you walk up a hill it takes energy, it takes puff out of you. Well, what you're doing is you're expending energy. So imagine what you want to do in putting in or developing new coal mines and new energy infrastructure or anything else. Not just in oil, it could be substitutes for oil, but it could be others. Is you want to climb a mountain, okay? And that mountain is the amount of energy you need to put it in, because it takes energy to build these things. It also is a measure of resources, like financial and everything else. And the time it takes you to walk is how long it takes to put in the infrastructure. Now, because we accept so much of the world around us, our evolving IT systems, monetary stability, all of these things, we stand there and we look up and say, it'll take this much energy, take this much financial resources, etc. But the real thing that peak oil does, it starts to undermine the ground beneath our feet, the things we stand on, the things we rely on, the IT systems, our banking system, faith in a piece of paper that we call money, that at the moment we hold faith in, but will not be so. All of these things. So, as that starts to fall apart, we start to see what our target was, disappearing as we drop down. And then our issue doesn't become how do we self-organise this global economy, because we didn't build it intentionally. It's a self-organised system. It won't be how do we rebuild it so that we can have the technologies we once might have had. It will be a much more direct thing. How can we feed ourselves? How can we keep social peace? How can we ensure that we have our basic survival things? And so we will be locked in a permanent lower energy use of all systems. And on the climate change issue, I think our emissions of fossil fuels are going to go vadum. I don't know to where. I think it's impossible to model. I just think they're going to drop for these reasons. I'm not sure what's going to happen in our land-based emissions, but I reckon we won't be running the global economy off them. So I think what you're going to see is the big globalizing demand for resources in places will not be there. But I think we're going to go much harder on our local resources. I think we're going to burn our bogs, and everything else. Local, in other words, where locally we can get environmental resources, we'll extract them. But I do think our anthropogenic emissions are going to drop. However, lest we think this is the solution, there are two problems. One is, we know there are other types of tipping points in the climate system. We really don't know where we are in them. So there could come a point where, those emissions, the amount in the atmosphere can still keep rising. But the second thing is about costs. When we talk about impact of climate change, we're talking about two things. It's what happens out there by the changing weather or whatever, and our ability to deal with it. And if we're whacked down, we've lost our fossil fuel input into our food production and everything else, we're going to have zilch resilience to anything. So something that we might be able to deal with now will just knock us over. And there will be no insurance markets because that's part of the financial system and everything else. So perversely, we could have a huge emissions drop.
Sure.
But the impacts could be dramatic.
Okay. Thank you, David. Just, I thought at this point, I'm going to make one assumption about our audience, if I may, and that is that I'm assuming pretty much everybody here understands that peak oil is an issue. I think is that a reasonable assumption? Okay, I guess that's why we're here. Could I ask for a show of hands for those who believe that we can manage, as Ciaran suggested, through this crisis? Let's accept that it's a crisis. Could I ask people who believe, yes, we can manage through this crisis to put their hands up at this point, please? Okay. And could I ask people who believe we can't manage through this crisis? Okay. You put up twice. Actually, I think... Can I join you? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, could I ask you to comment, to tell us a little bit about that? Just right in front of you here, Davy, in the purple. Here we go. Me? Yeah, please. Yeah, please tell us why you need to put your hand up twice. It's interesting.
I'm living down in rural West Limerick, and I'm teaching people hopefully sustainable skills. And I'm learning alongside of them as well. And there are people who are coming from farms that aren't financially viable, from construction that can no longer employ them, and they're not looking for doomsday scenarios. We'll wait for Hollywood to do that one. What they're looking for is a hope and a possibility of a way that they might be survivors.
Okay, right. Could I ask as well on that, given that you've obviously been in both camps, could I ask one of the people who said, yes, we can manage through this crisis, maybe would like to just say how they see that happening? Any takers on the people who said yes? There's a lady just back there, Davy. No? Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that I didn't put up my hand at all.
Oh, you didn't? Oh, okay, well, sure.
I felt you really needed to define your terms. Sorry to be...
That's all right, yeah, go ahead.
But, like, what do you mean by managing? It's a bit vague, really.
Okay, let me know. It's a good point, but let me try and define it, okay? The expectation. I've got 2 young kids. I would like, as a parent, as I'm sure many other people here, I'd like to believe that they've got a crack at the kind of life that I've had the opportunity to live. Right? I'd like to believe that, okay? And maybe the reason I'm here is because I'd like to believe that. I'd like to keep an open mind on it. Despite, it took me about a week to get over David's report, I might add, a lot of drink. But we got there, we got over it. And you get knocked over and you come bouncing back up again and you say, you know what, we just keep on going because what are the alternatives to that? So I guess if I can define the question, I'd like to believe that this generation are leaving behind a world that is habitable in a way that we would recognise. Accepting, for example, that when my grandmother was born, there was only 1.6 billion of us on the planet, and her world was quite different. I do accept that my children's world will not be a world of consumptive plenty, as we have. I think that'll be in the past. But really the question is it going to be, a Korowitz hell? Or is it going to be, a Davy resilient, future? That's that's really what I meant. I hope that clarifies it. The gentleman here with the tie? Yeah, just here, yeah.
We don't live in a world of wealth. We actually live in a world of extreme poverty in large proportion of the world.
Sure.
Much of the people in the world are already facing the kind of crises which David has laid out for our own future. Just a couple of quick points to make. One is on peak oil. I don't think we're guaranteed to actually reach any true peak oil because we've already reached actually an artificial peak oil. There are oil rigs currently, there are oil platforms that are not being repaired because they can't access capital, the companies that would be contracted to repair them. There are refineries going offline because they can't access capital as well. And that is having an effect on restraining supply in certain areas. Obviously, peak oil is a global issue, but the responses and the effects of it are localized or regionalized at least. It's not the same all over the world. The second issue about, I think there's a lot of naivety about that we can't go to coal. that's nonsense. We are going to coal. Everyone who can go to coal is going to coal. Currently, coal stations are being opened in China in every few days. So the reality is, it's a readily available fuel. It's all over the world. It's in different regions, and we have extensive technology that we've already built up to exploit it and to use it. So I think the future, it's not that unknown. I think what we're facing into is very dirty, very badly industrialized regions, like central China as it is now, and the rest of the world's falling behind, similar to Victorian times, how you had industrialized Manchester and then in other areas of England people living in absolute poverty. So I think we have to be realistic about the effects. The financial system vulnerability to this crisis is severe, and we've already experienced that. In some respect, it was a contributing factor, but also with this notion about coal, the people who have access to coal are not don't have a debate about climate change. They're actually just exploiting it at the fastest rate that they can. So maybe that might be useful for us for some comment.
Sure. Maybe there's a gentleman behind there who's been waiting to get in.
Sorry, I had a kind of question from earlier. It was more for Ciaran as well, but it was about
I'll answer for him, no worries.
Ireland, obviously we have to be self-sustainable in our energy production, and the government seems to be talking a lot about wind energy, and I'm a bit concerned about it because at the moment wind energy, we can't store energy in this country. So if wind energy comes online, we need to use that straight away, but we always need a backup. And should the government be looking into something along the lines of nuclear, even though it's very, I'm an environmentalist, but still I think we should really be looking into what's the best way of making Ireland sustainable. And should we be looking into one large nuclear power plant or something along the lines? Because I think wind and the likes of, they may be green, but we need something that's always there. You need energy to
base load energy, sure.
You can't rely on wind energy, because if Ireland can't get any more oil, we can't rely on wind energy, because there mightn't be wind for months. You know what I mean? Enough wind to power the whole energy system, because the energy grid always needs a backup. So maybe nuclear, maybe something that's granted it's not green energy, but it still needs to be looked at.
Yeah, I guess it depends also on how you define green. I think lower impact might be a more accurate way of putting it, and I think there is an argument certainly, and it's a different argument in relation to nuclear, and I'm sure I'd like to commit Ciaran and his colleagues to a pro-nuclear future in his absence. Sorry, a gentleman just here.
I'm a little bit surprised. I'm just a visitor to Ireland today, and listening to the discussion makes me scared and very afraid.
Of us, or generally?
Generally, because one thing, I see this doom scenario coming from the environmental scientists, which sounds for me like a marketing message to do something, but they don't tell me what to do really about it. And they seem to be criticizing government for not moving ahead. The same old scenario. NGOs, critics blame government, they blame business not to move forward. So each other blames each other, and it seems like the discussion is going on for 20 years already. So I think what's the strategy here to get out of this kind of blaming and moving forward together? And then I see a government representative who lulls us into believing that the government is already doing so much, when we think there's a dooming scenario. So neither party really tells me as a citizen, if I consider myself to be a global citizen, what can I do? How can we support as all we sit here tonight? What shall we do different when we go home tomorrow morning and say, what can we do different in the way we educate, and the way we run our businesses, and the way we live our family lives? So I feel like there's a strong marketing message, but there's no number I can call to order the product.
Sure. Yeah, Richard, please.
I think that's a really, really important point. And I suppose it's always good to get the outsider's perspective. And I suppose it's kind of interesting in that when I came here tonight, I was really hoping not to kind of come down too hard on the doomer side of the equation, and I'm sure I have. Because like John said, after recovering from David's report, you've got a sort of a natural endorphin level in your brain that regulates generally your sort of level of optimism. And obviously I've got a sort of generally high level. I don't go running around kind of trying to have meetings with Ciaran Cuffe, particularly when he comes along and says a lot of what he said tonight, which clearly demonstrates that I've not been very effective. Because I'm a pessimist. I'm clearly an optimist. That's why I sort of do what I'm interested in this subject as I am. But I think the particular point that you make about, what's the number that I dial to buy the product that you're selling? And in this regard, I think it's probably where the peak oil problem and the climate change problem come together, in the sense that it's the same frustration, I think, that the general public feels from the climate change message, is that, my action as an individual, I use a certain amount of electricity, a certain amount of petrol, if I use that much, you heard actually Ciaran give a very good demonstration of how futile the exercise of an individual can be, in the sense of it can simply get lost. And Mackay, the guy behind renewable energy without the hot air, I don't know if you saw that report. It's an excellent report. And he just commented on how much electricity the average Briton uses, and he just said it's enormous. And if you put that in the context of the reductions that are required to address climate change, i.e. 80% within a 10-year time frame, that incremental individual action stuff isn't going to get us to where we want to go fast enough. So the product that we need to buy is actually a collective consciousness, collective action. The idea that I can go home and do something as an individual and actually have an impact on this, it's sort of the agency debate. It's not going to work like that. And again, the example and sort of the issue of transition towns, of that lady there, in terms of what she's trying to do down in Limerick, where a group of people, because when you sort of lock yourself in a room and you think about this and say, well, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to head to the hills and build a little hut. I'm going to bring a 6-gauge shotgun and a bag of bullets and a 6-month supply of beans. That isn't going to get us there, because if the kind of David Korowitz hell scenario breaks out, and I know that
sorry for the nickname,
Ciaran Cuffe, sorry, that's going to stick. Ciaran Cuffe is on the side of a hill with 6-month supply of beans, and I just have to dodge his bullets to get to them. That's kind of so you can see that the lifeboat scenario doesn't work. It's that dilemma that we've all got to arrive on the same page and act, it's sort of going back to the human nature aspect. We're a competitive, collaborative species. We compete, but we cooperate. And it's the requirement, and that's why, when we kind of criticize government and sort of say that they're not doing enough, it's because in many respects, they're the people that we elect to represent us to act collectively. Because the only way we're going to deal with this in a way that we sort of retain our human dignity in terms of social order and access to the things that we need just to survive and get by is if we act collectively. And the danger is that we are sort of, because there's 30 people in this room, there's 4.5 million people outside it, and they're not ready for what's coming down the track. And them not being ready means that we're going to deal with it in the worst possible scenario. So when I talk about the requirement or the need for risk management, that's what I'm talking about. It's about mapping out all the various different scenarios and saying the future is not predetermined. We don't know what's going to happen, but here's a particular scenario that has a probability, or the politics of possibility that Ciaran talked. This is possible, and we need to plan appropriately. And all we're asking for is planning, and that's not even happening.
Just on that, I read a history of the lesser-known siege of Leningrad. We all heard of Stalingrad, but Leningrad went on for 900 days. And what stayed in my mind after that book was how the citizens of Leningrad were determined that it wasn't happening. As news began to filter about the German advances, it wasn't happening. It was all it was counter-propaganda, etc., etc. They could hear the shells. At about 90 miles out, when the Germans got to about 90 miles from Leningrad, they could hear the shelling. But they said, no, it's okay, there's a river. They'll never get across that river. The people of Leningrad wouldn't even go to meetings to talk about their collective future until the shells started landing in the city. And that is, as David so eloquently described it earlier, that's the human condition. That's what we do. We will come to this crisis, or this crisis will come to us. Or both, possibly at the same time. Sorry, there's a gentleman here who'd like to come in. Sorry for the soliloquy.
Just on that very point, like I've been listening, I've done a lot of work on this myself, and I was listening to people talking about changing consciousness and all that. I really don't think there's any time for anything as nice as that.
Agree.
Or trying to get everybody to do the same thing, or, you know. But most of the other civilizations which collapsed did so more or less knowingly in their head that, you know, we're running out of wood, but we just keep going because it has to keep going. And that's probably what will happen to us, unless I think that we might have a chance if a really bad thing happens early that doesn't completely blow us out completely. Like, it's like the guy who smokes all his life and he knows it could give you cancer, but the doctor calls him in one day and says, listen, there's a shadow on your lung. Just want to check it out. Checks it out, it's benign. The guy gives up smoking straight away because he's got that really scary bit before the cancer actually happens. And what I'd like to ask the panel is can you see a possible really big scary thing that could happen over the next few years that would really change, like overnight, people's consciousness, rather than waiting for the drip feed, the economy is going up and down, oil prices are going up and down? Is there a scary thing that might save us from ourselves?
A virus that targets Republicans, for example.
Well, it's September 2008.
Yeah, but life goes on. I mean,
Well, there's the answer to your question.
yeah. But is there one like to do with energy? That's what I'm wondering. Like, say if oil got cut off for 2 years for whatever weird reason,
I think
people died in Ireland of starvation.
I've often thought you wouldn't be allowed to do it, that it would be a salutary lesson if we turned off our grid and our ability to sell petrol for a week and just say, wait and see what happens. Now, people would start dying in hospitals. There would be all sorts of, we'd have a food crisis, etc., etc.
No Joe Duffy.
No Joe Duffy. So, I mean, that would be great. But I think, look, I don't know I don't know exactly how. I can tell you there has to be a financial crisis, and I'm telling you this one will continue and it'll get worse, etc., etc. Can I come back to this gentleman here about what do you do? Who do you call? Ghostbusters. I think part of, most of us are semi-voluntary, and a lot of people who've been doing the work have been retired, like Colin Campbell, or they haven't been in the academic world, or very few of them have. They've been sort of off-kilter people from off-kilter places, sort of noticing these things. And many of us, I suppose, carry a little bit of angst because, we're shaking up against, a large culture. And sometimes it might come out, we're going, oh my God, I want to tell you about this. Look what's happening. But I suppose in these short periods, you don't really get a chance to take people through and explicate things. I think we're going to go through a hellish time. But if we get through that time, things are going to get a lot better. We're going to learn, I suspect, how to adapt and live in this new context. In a way, I think it's terrifying, but maybe even good. But I think we're going to crash very quickly. It's not going to be a drawn-out process. And that then things might start to get better. In the interim, I'd say, okay, what we want to do is like we're gathering, there's a storm approaching. We've got to grab a kit bag. That's all we're going to have in this storm, or at least all we know we're going to need. What are we going to put in it? And I can ask the government, here's your kit bag. What are you going to put in it? I can ask local government. I can ask individuals. I can ask businesses and say, now, the first thing is they won't know what to do about a kit bag, to put in their kit bag, unless they're familiar with the storm. So unfortunately, one has to explain what a storm is first, so they understand, because they're totally unfamiliar in general. Do you know what I mean? So there is something to say to each of these. And, as an individual, I would say, well, there's already a plug to tap into, which is transition towns. I think there's very important things about growing your own food, learning to preserve things. There's a huge range. And one of the things I suppose I say to people is, look, this is depressing. It is depressing. If you weren't depressed by it, you probably have some sort of pathological problem. You know? So, what is the way? You know, I used to wake up kind of going, oh, fuck, you know, freaked out. Not so much really anymore.
You've kind of passed it on to the rest of us.
What is it? You by doing things, by responding to the situation, you start to deal with your anxiety because you start in your own way to take control of your own agency and the predicament we're in. And you will find other people, and that always helps. It could be transition initiatives, it could be other things, where you say, what can we learn together? Because one of the things, I suppose, gets me about, you know, other people, and I know people in Ireland now are suffering. They're losing their jobs, for instance. And that always galls me when I hear people are losing their jobs, because I know it's a culturally constructed thing. Because effectively I have no job, yet I work a lot. We all can do things. Work isn't just what you're paid for. So if we could turn to people now and say, you know, what your unemployment is an opportunity to do far more important things than you ever did before, which is about, you know, building your resilience, etc., etc. It's about sort of taking ownership. So it can be a really depressing thing, it is, but it also provides us with something like a meaning or a challenge that is worthwhile, more worthwhile than anything else we've been doing. I mean, look out there what happened for the last 10 years. It may have given us pleasure, but I don't think anybody could say this has been one of the great sort of personal, collective, brilliant, glittering things in terms of our creativity or anything else. You know, we were able to spend money, and we could buy supposedly the creativity of others. So
now, thank you, David. Davy, just second row here when you're ready. Here we go.
Thanks very much. If we're to act collectively, I think the very first thing we should do is to try and get back our natural resources. Now, down in Corowitz, the people are fighting a very lonely battle to try and get the process done correctly. But inherent in that and inherent in us all is that they are our resources by birthright. So that's a very, very important thing to do, and that would take a lot of the stress and the hellish nightmare that is ahead of us, and we've been reminded of that all night. So there would be a smoothing or a transition to maybe a new future, but to try and get back our resources. So what did the lads on top table think of that?
Well, I hope the Saudis don't ask for their birthright back quickly, or we'll have no oil before peak oil. Yeah. You know, I mean, that, you know, we do very well out of the globalised economy. But I do think, you know what I actually do think? In truth, I think we need that probably built as quick as possible. And if Shell or whoever builds it, fair enough. But I think we're going to be appropriating these stuff soon enough. In other words, I can see an era of pretty severe resource nationalism on those things. So basically, Shell will build it, and we'll take it over as a nation. I mean, that's, you know, when the stakes are high, that's what happens. Because we're not going to develop it now. We've no money, and nobody's going to lend us very much.
But presumably, whether it's Shell or anybody else, and the Republic of Ireland doesn't have the technological wherewithal to extract those resources anyway. We're in this system. And I think really I would suggest what you're talking about is the equity of extraction, who gets the benefit from extraction, not who does the extraction. Am I reading you rightly? That really the discussion is about the benefit of extraction rather than the fact of extraction. I don't know of any Irish indigenous company that can do offshore drilling. So if we want to drill, if we want to take out those resources, if we're able to take out those resources, presumably that's a function. You know, we don't make cars in Ireland either. You know, there's so many services that we buy in from abroad. So presumably, I assume the issue with Shell is an issue of equity. In other words, what's the share of the Irish public? Yep. And by the way, sorry, Davy's just reminded me we've got 5 minutes to wrap it up. So anyone who's really keen who hasn't come in, there's a woman here. Hang on, here it comes.
I'm an unemployed architect, a tiger cub, and they've probably half answered my question already. But Ciaran was really the aim for this. But he spoke about the emergency and how Ireland adapted, and you cut up your matches. I'm delighted for you. And you spoke of the entitlements that we feel that we're obliged to get. Somehow I feel that this oil-dependent living consumerism was all marketed at us, and the government let this happen. So our entitlement is not, it's not far, like it's forced upon us. Like we're a generation that don't know anything else.
It's a manufactured entitlement, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Or a manufactured sense of entitlement?
Yeah, consumerism and the way it came from America and all the rest of it. So I guess from that then, and if you watch something like The Age of Stupid, or The Story of Stuff, or any of these wonderful things that are out there at the moment. Like, the government, here's a generation, we're highly skilled, we have hope, and I'd love to see what sort of incentives are there for us with our gift of time that we have received now, and you've kind of addressed this already. What are we going to, like, I want to do something, I'm here today, I've got the gift of time to be here today, I wouldn't have been here this time last year, or this time 3 years ago. So I guess I'm just kind of saying, what's there for us to do now? And you've got an army of 20, 30-somethings out there ready to do stuff. They just need a bit of hope, but they're not going to get it standing on the dole queue.
And can I ask you, have you had any sense of optimism, hope, or a different perspective from what you've heard this evening?
I think you're near the end of... No, you're talking about David's hell. I think he's talking... There's a little bit of a heaven there somewhere far away in the fluffy clouds. I was here earlier on today, and that's what we have done today. Okay. And I guess that's a bit more hopeful and positive. This is totally different. No, I see hope, but I can also see this lady's point of view here beside me as well. So I see hope, but I'm wondering, like, as I said, there's an army of people ready to do something, and can someone just lead us?
Yeah, that's a pretty good start. Actually, it's a very good start.
Yeah, can I say hands up here? Don't in any way feel inhibited. Those who are unemployed or feel they could do more work. Okay, it's quite a number. Okay, here's an idea. I jotted it down and did a couple of pages, and I never did anything with it. And I'm only using it as an example, if you all want to see it as that. Do you know that Ireland has, our government, through you, owns a whack load of land? We got that recently. It's in Nama. All of this agricultural land. And guess what? It's next to settlements. Now, you can put together a deal about growing food. But hold on. Here's the thing. If you want to do that on that scale, you have a great opportunity, because unlike the local garden plot down the road, where it's basically a few locals, if you can do that at scale, and if anyone wants to talk to me about it, you know, you're welcome to run with it, you can start to say, okay, now we can make education materials, because we've enough people. You also need not bought seeds, you actually need sort of indigenous seeds that don't die in one go. But there's enough area in Nama that are outside of where you'd be producing food that you can produce those seeds. Now, what do those people, gardeners, need? Because we're going to have to develop this industry ourselves. They need shovels, they need spades, they need all sorts of things. There's only one tool maker in Ireland. So hold on, we need new materials. We need to teach people well to grow, and you can't really do it in a short plot. We've loads of land, and I can tell you how you can construct it as a sort of argument or deal. And if there's enough of you, you don't have to say we're heading for doom. You can just say to Nama, you owe us. We want to rent it per acre at £5 a year, because otherwise it's doing nothing. And basically, we want it for 4 years. And after that, we want it 2 years go. You have to give us a year's notice. Now, I think that land will never be developed, but you don't have to tell them that. They get the freedom to say, because it's going to take them a while to sell land, and they can get planning permission while you're still working it. I don't think they will. You don't have to tell them that and assume that. But they feel they have the freedom for everything goes boom again. So there is an idea of what you can do. And I'm sure there are countless others. They're there. They're about things we need to develop. You can do them.
On that note as well, I think the average age, I read somewhere recently, of the Irish farmer is somewhere between 60 and 65. We have a whole generation of farmers, and I'm from most of us are one generation away from agriculture. You know, you may have heard the phrase, and it's a phrase I used in the first article I wrote about peak oil about 2.5 years ago, and that was it was attributed to a Saudi prince who said that my father rode a camel, I drive a car, my son flies a jet, his son will ride a camel. So I think that's the way we're heading now. He wasn't saying that in a doomer way. He said that's life. We've had our fun. We've spent our legacy, and now we're going to have to figure out how to come back down the other side of Hubbard's Peak, and maybe beyond some of these scenarios, maybe there is a different life, a life which I think we will currently find very threatening. But having read, for example, about some of the hell endured by workers in Chinese factories like Foxconn, where people are they're putting up screens around windows to stop employees throwing themselves out. They've had a mass of suicides. These are young people, so desperate, so despairing of their lives as factory slaves, effectively, that they're literally trying to end themselves. So I think when you see any species starting towards suicide, you get a sense, all right, that maybe we're on the wrong path anyway. And hopefully, if we want to take a positive message from this, it is wrenching adjustments are coming, but, they're coming anyway. We need to be aware of them, and maybe without being silly and fallacious and believing it'll all be fine, wrenching adjustments are coming. We need to prepare for them. We need to prepare ourselves for them, and therefore people in this room need to also prepare your families and your communities for the fact that we're heading into very different times. I think at this point we should wrap it up. I'm going to hand it back to Davy, if I may.